Hello, my name is Danielle Crawford. I am a PhD candidate in the Literature Department at UC Santa Cruz, and today I'm going to be presenting a talk titled CLI-FI, Interdisciplinary Archives and Digital Exhibits, Strategies for Teaching Climate Change in the Literature and Composition Classroom. So I'll go ahead and dive right in. Anthropogenic climate change is arguably one of the greatest challenges of our time, and it is intimately tied to the human experience. Humanity, and specifically populations in the global north, are the driving force behind greenhouse gas emissions, while the disasters of a warming planet, such as stronger and more frequent storms, wildfires, droughts, and rising sea levels, promise to dramatically shape the very nature of our existence. And yet, despite the deep human roots of climate change, it is often regarded the terrain of the environmental sciences in the college classroom. In this paper, I argue that a humanities-based approach to climate change pedagogy allows us to better understand how climate change is shaped by human interactions, imaginings, and deeply embedded social inequalities. Drawing from my own teaching experiences at UC Santa Cruz, I explore three different strategies for teaching climate change in the college literature and composition classroom. The first is the use of climate fiction alongside nonfiction narratives. The second is the incorporation of an interdisciplinary archive of reading materials. And the third is the construction of digital exhibits. The first strategy focuses on assigning works of climate fiction alongside nonfiction narratives of climate change in the literature classroom. Before getting into this strategy, I want to provide a brief overview of what climate fiction is. Climate fiction, which is often abbreviated as CLI-FI, is a literary genre that specifically examines the disastrous impact of climate change within a fictional setting. The term CLI-FI was first coined by journalist and environmental activist Dan Bloom around 2007, and this genre really starts gaining momentum in the 2000s with the publication of works such as Margaret Atwood's Mad Adam trilogy, beginning with the Oryx and the Crake in 2003, Barbara Kingsolver's Flight Behavior in 2012, Kim Stanley Robinson's The Science in the Capital trilogy, beginning with 40 Signs of Rain in 2004, and Ian McEwan's Solar in 2010, to name just a few. Although CLI-FI is a speculative genre, J.K. Ulrich, in an article from The Atlantic, notes that it deviates from traditional science fiction as, quote, its stories seldom focus on imaginary technologies or faraway planets, end quote. Instead, CLI-FI is steeped in the reality of climate change and projects us into a world devastated by the effects of global warming. The genre is, in the words of Katie Waldman from the New Yorker, quote, a fictional representation of scientifically substantiated predictions that too many people discount as fictions, end quote. Yet, despite its label as fiction, CLI-FI can often incite more urgency in its audiences than nonfiction scientific reports. Ulrich uses the example of a 2006 working paper from the Tyndall Center for Climate Change Research, which features, quote, a study exploring whether a climate fiction experience, in this case the popular, if scientifically flawed, apocalypse film The Day After Tomorrow, would elicit stronger reactions from participants than simply reading a body of information about the causes and effects of climate change, end quote. While, quote, both sets of respondents reported a positive shift in their concern about climate change following the experiment, the group that viewed the film reported a slightly higher willingness to reform social behaviors in favor of mitigating climate change, end quote from Ulrich. These responses of urgency to a fictional representation are perhaps due to the power of narratives and their ability to create empathy and connection that a report on climate change, even if scientifically accurate, cannot always do. So this brings me to my first strategy of assigning CLI-FI alongside nonfiction literary narratives of climate change in the literature classroom. With this strategy, I argue that analyzing works of CLI-FI alongside nonfiction narratives of real disaster creates a productive tension with a decolonizing potential, one that allows students to address disparities between imaginings of the climate crisis, which are often centered in the global north, and their lived reality in the global south. I used this tactic in two upper division literature courses that I taught at UC Santa Cruz. The first was titled Typhoons, Hurricanes, and Tsunamis, Global Disaster Narratives, and the second was titled Reading the Weather, Literature and Global Climate Change. And both of these courses were focused on fiction and nonfiction representations of climate disasters. In one of the units for these courses, I signed the poetry collection Versus Typhoon Yolanda, A Storm of Filipino Poets, which was published in 2014 and edited by Eileen Tabios. This collection focuses on the devastation wrought by 2013 Super Typhoon Yolanda in the Philippines. This typhoon, internationally known as Haiyan, was one of the strongest tropical cyclones in recorded history, resulting in a staggering 10,000 deaths, with the most destruction in the central Philippine islands of Leyte and Samar. The poetry collection, Versus Typhoon Yolanda, poetically explores the painful aftermath of the storm and its lingering impact from a variety of languages and viewpoints within the Filipinx diaspora, all while connecting the typhoon to a longer history of colonial violence, environmental abuse, and the politics of global warming. After my students read this collection, I had them watch Roland Emmerich's 2004 film, The Day After Tomorrow. This work of sci-fi is set in the present day and depicts an imagined disaster, wherein a dramatic climate shift or rapid cooling starts a new ice age, which produces a number of weather anomalies, such as destructive tornadoes in Los Angeles and a freezing superstorm that hits the Northern Hemisphere, including New York City, which is one of the key sites of the film. As mentioned earlier by Ulrich, the science of this film is completely inaccurate, so I wasn't interested in having my students think through the environmental consequences of an ice age. Instead, I used this film as a point of comparison with Versus Typhoon Yolanda in order to get them thinking critically about the distinct positionalities of the global north and the global south in relation to climate change, and specifically uneven vulnerability and culpability that falls along these geographical lines. In Versus Typhoon Yolanda, we see a poetic representation of a real lived disaster in the Philippines, a nation in the global south that is impacted and will continue to be impacted by the increasing frequency and intensity of extreme storm systems on a warming planet, all of which is reflective of this larger vulnerability of the global south to climate change. In contrast, the film The Day After Tomorrow reverses this dynamic by shifting climate change vulnerability to the global north, with a freezing superstorm instead hitting the northern hemisphere, creating a reversal that also evades the culpability of wealthy nations in the global north, and specifically the United States, for their extensive emissions of greenhouse gases. So by pinning this work of sci-fi alongside a nonfiction poetic narrative, it creates a productive tension that allows students to consider how the global north imagines itself in relation to climate change, and how this differs from the lived reality of the climate crisis. While assigning sci-fi alongside nonfiction narratives in the literature classroom can help us to think through the politics of climate change imaginings, using an interdisciplinary archive of reading materials can create a much-needed dialogue between the science of climate change and its literary representations, which brings me to my second strategy. In order to think through the importance of interdisciplinarity in climate change pedagogy, the concept of a wicked problem is useful. The term was first coined in 1973 by Horst Reidel and Melvin Weber in an article for Policy Sciences. Sandra S. Beatty writes that, quote, "Wicked problems, which are sometimes called social messes or untamed problems, are dynamically complex, ill-structured public problems, which tend to be intractable and elusive because they are influenced by many dynamic social and political factors as well as biophysical complexities." End quote. Climate change is a key example of a wicked problem, and in taking this title a step further, it was dubbed a super wicked problem in a 2012 policy article by Kelly Levin and co-authors. Levin and co-authors write that the super wicked problem of climate change is composed of, quote, 4 key features: that time is running out, those who cause the problem also seek to provide a solution, the central authority needed to address it is weak or non-existent, and partly, as a result, policy responses discount the future irrationally, end quote, which means they're working on a very short-term time horizon. They note that these features, quote, create a policy-making tragedy, where traditional analytical techniques are ill-equipped to identify solutions, even when it is well recognized that actions must take place soon to avoid catastrophic future impacts, end quote. So we need to think of new methods and tactics for addressing the super wicked problem of climate change, and one of these tactics is interdisciplinarity, both an interdisciplinary approach to our understanding of climate change and an interdisciplinary approach to the creation of climate change policies. In an article on wicked problems and applied economics, Beatty writes that, quote, "Normal science assumptions and approaches are inadequate for addressing the complexities of wicked problems in a policy context," end quote, she argues that the integration of both the sciences and the social sciences, in this case applied economics, are, quote, crucial for the development of alternative policies, end quote. I would take this a step further and argue that the integration of the sciences, the social sciences, and the humanities is key to generating a nuanced and socially informed approach to the wicked problem of climate change. One of the places where we can create these productive interdisciplinary conversations about climate change is in the classroom, and we can do this by curating an archive of reading materials that come from a wide range of fields. This was something I endeavored to do in my class on literature and global climate change. In one of the first units for this course, I assigned Octavia Butler's 1993 novel, The Parable of the Sower. This is a work of sci-fi set in the 2020s in the California landscape, and it shows a state racked by prolonged drought, frequent fires, and food shortages as a result of climate change, all amidst a growing socioeconomic class divide. I paired this novel with secondary readings on drought in California, specifically policy articles on California's recent extreme drought, as well as scientific articles on California wildfires and fire ecology. These secondary readings helped my students understand the concepts of drought and wildfire on a deeper level, as they learned about the difference between a meteorological drought and an agricultural drought, and the intimate link between wildfires, carbon sequestration, and climate change. On the other hand, the novel allowed my students to deeply examine the social impacts of drought, wildfire, and resource scarcity, and the ways in which these disasters often intersect with racialized and class divisions. Coincidentally, my students were reading Parable of the Sower at the same time as the 2017 wine country fires. So reading about fire in Butler's novel and in the scientific articles alongside real-time news reports of devastating fires raging across Northern California created a really eerie, immediate connection that helped to incite urgency in my students and really drive home the importance of our analyses and discussions. In another unit for this course, my students read Barbara Kingsolver's 2012 novel, Flight Behavior, which is a work of sci-fi set in the rural Appalachia region that documents a dramatic change in the migration patterns of the monarch butterfly, a shift that is attributed to the warming temperatures of global climate change. And this shift in migration puts the species of butterfly at risk for extinction. So I paired this novel with scientific articles on species extinctions, and specifically the link between forecasted species extinctions and climate change. In addition to these readings, some of my students were also able to visit the Monarch Butterfly Preserve at Natural Bridges State Beach in Santa Cruz, which is an overwintering site for the western and North American population of monarchs. And this preserve is witnessing a major decline in the number of monarchs visiting it each year, partly as a result of climate change, which is something my students learned about during their visit. So these experiences, combined with their interdisciplinary readings, gave students a much more nuanced and in-depth understanding of the environmental issues we were covering. And just as importantly, this interdisciplinary reading list allowed students from very different majors to feel more empowered in a humanities classroom. For instance, during our readings on California wildfires, I had students from sciences and environmental studies majors who were much more well-versed in fire ecology than myself. So they were really able to take the reins during these discussions and share their knowledge with their peers. And I think these were very important moments in the course, as it helped to forge an interdisciplinary dialogue where students could bring their different fields and expertise to the table. And it's these types of conversations that I think we need to keep having, both inside and outside of the classroom, in order to address the wicked problem of climate change. The remainder of this paper is going to focus on the third and final strategy of assigning public-facing digital projects, and specifically digital exhibits. And I'm going to shift my focus from the literature classroom to the composition or first-year writing classroom. When teaching climate change and environmental issues in an introductory writing class, I think it's important to rethink the types of assignments we're giving and really push beyond the confines of the traditional essay. Having students construct digital exhibits is one way to go about this. And this is a tactic I used during a composition course I taught at UC Santa Cruz titled Writing in the Environment, Place and Ecology. The course was based in eco-composition, which is a burgeoning field in first-year writing studies. Sidney Dobrin defines eco-composition as a field that, quote, draws attention to the ideas of context and social construction of identity to include physical realities of place and of natural and constructed space, end quote. In other words, eco-composition, according to the scholarship of Dobrin and Christian Weiser, identifies place and the environment as a critical topic of investigation and inquiry in the writing classroom, and this can certainly include climate change. For the course that I taught, my students chose a relatively local place to write in for the duration of the class, and they used this place of focus to produce different writing genres. They started off with a narrative photo essay describing their visit to their site, and then they worked up to a research essay that examined a key environmental issue connected to their place of focus. And climate change was a recurring theme in many of these research essays. For example, one of my students investigated the intersection between rising sea levels and coastal armoring at a local beach, while another examined the projected impacts of climate change at the popular Fisherman's Wharf in San Francisco. This research on place and climate change was ultimately showcased in digital exhibits, which served as the culminating projects for the class. For this digital project, we used Scalar, an online publishing platform that is freely accessible and open source. Scalar, in the words of the Alliance for Networking Visual Culture website, quote, enables users to assemble media from multiple sources and juxtapose them with their own writing in a variety of ways with minimal technical expertise required, end quote. This website goes on to state that Scalar, quote, gives authors tools to structure essay and book-length works in ways that take advantage of the unique capabilities of digital writing, including nested, recursive, and nonlinear formats. And indeed, my students were able to produce projects that really showcase these unique capabilities of digital writing. They were essentially curating a particular experience of their place for a general audience, much like how you might curate an experience for visitors of a physical exhibition or installation. Their exhibits were composed of a singular path or a larger theme that was then linked to 3 separate pages or 3 smaller topics that were nested under that theme. You might think of it like a hiking trail. The path or theme was the main trail, while the pages were smaller trails that branched off and diverged from the main one. And someone's experience of this path could vary from one reader to the next. For instance, someone might click on just one of the pages in the exhibit, or all 3, or they might choose to visit those pages in a different order. And that's where this idea of a nonlinear format or structure comes in. So my students were being challenged to produce narratives that were once interconnected and self-contained, and also able to stand alone. Within these different pages, they embedded different types of media, and I think this was one of the real strengths of using Scalar in the writing classroom, as it allowed students to work with a wide range of media in a way that made the project much more immediate and accessible. In their exhibits, they embedded photos they took of their place, images from the web, YouTube videos, memes, maps, and even short films and documentaries. For example, one student embedded memes about the drought in California alongside discussions of the environmental impact of golf course maintenance, while another student, who focused on the monarch butterfly preserve at Natural Bridges, was able to embed news clips in the form of videos about monarch migrations in Santa Cruz. My students were excited about getting to work with forms of media such as YouTube videos that they are very familiar with and that they often encounter on a daily basis. These different types of audio and visual media, paired along with their own writing, work to create multimodal narratives that utilize multiple literacies and forms of representation in order to create a more nuanced portrayal of their place of focus and its environmental issues. Lastly, I think it's important to note that these Scalar exhibits were public-facing projects, which makes them particularly well-suited for the public issue of climate change. Once they were finished, my students had the option of making their exhibits public by publishing them on the web. And this would make their exhibits accessible to a global audience instead of just myself and their peers. And this decision of going public was a personal choice that I left up to my students. But whatever their choices were, the option provided an interesting opportunity for students to see the relevance and importance of their work beyond the confines of the classroom. I had some of my students come up to me and tell me that they felt their projects had more meaning and purpose to them simply because of their ability to translate to a larger audience. And in the context of teaching climate change, I think this is really important. Students want to feel like the research they're doing on climate change and the environment is getting out beyond the classroom and making an impact. And much of the work that needs to be done regarding the climate crisis is educating the public about the urgency of these issues, as well as trying to counter destructive narratives of climate change denial. And by assigning public-facing projects in a composition or literature course, you're really inviting students to take part in this important work and dialogue. It raises the stakes of what you're doing inside the classroom. And I should note that Scalar is by no means the only platform you can use to do these kinds of public-facing projects. There are many others that could serve a similar purpose, such as story maps or even podcasts. In the example I gave, Scalar was just a platform that I chose to use, but you could certainly use others. In closing, this talk has examined 3 different strategies for employing climate change pedagogy in the composition and literature classroom, ranging from comparative readings of cli-fi and nonfiction narratives of disaster, to the use of interdisciplinary reading materials and the construction of public-facing digital projects. There certainly are many other strategies that you can use to teach climate change in a humanities-based setting, so this list is not meant to be comprehensive by any means. But these are just some tactics that I have found luck with in the classroom, and it is my hope that they can help create a more expansive, interdisciplinary climate change pedagogy that connects students from vastly different fields of study. That's the end of my talk. Thank you for listening, and I look forward to any questions or comments that you might have. Thank you so much.